Hi bakers and makers, let's get ready to make our royal icing for our cookies. First we're going to start out with sifting our powdered sugar into a bowl. Make sure that you always sift your powdered sugar. I'm using a smaller whisk here so I'm going to do about half the amount at a time. But this will keep a really smooth icing, and it'll keep from having little clumps getting stuck in your piping tips or in your piping bag, and also in your icing, which kind of could leave lumps and bumps and stuff in your finished project. So make sure that you sift that icing sugar, even if you add some at a later time. We use a lot of icing sugar or powdered sugar. Royal icing is such an easy thing to make. It's essentially egg whites and powdered sugar. I do add a little bit of cream of tartar. I think I missed showing that in this video, but I do add about 1/4 teaspoon of cream of tartar, which helps it set up a little bit stiffer and a little bit drier. Now that we've got all of that sifted into our mixing bowl, we are going to add some egg whites. I'm also going to add some corn syrup, light corn syrup, so that we don't add any color. This really helps to add elasticity to our icing. So you can skip the corn syrup if you choose, but I really like the way it helps piping. I'm just going to give a little bit of a stir here just to keep my powdered sugar from flying everywhere. I kind of just moisten it up a little bit by mixing in the egg whites. You don't have to mix it all the way or completely or anything here. Now let's go ahead and attach our bowl onto the mixer. Add our whisk attachment. Now make sure that you don't whisk any higher than about a level 4 or 5. I'm speeding up this video a little bit so you don't have to just watch my mixer run, but here I've got it at about a speed of 3. I'm going to add a couple of drops of lemon extract because that works with the cookies that I'm making today. You can also use almond extract or vanilla or any other extract you choose. And my mixer's been going for about 2 minutes here, and you can still see how loose this icing is. It's not quite ready to be used either for piping or for glue or anything else. So we're going to turn it back on to about a speed of a 4, maybe a 5, but no higher than 5. Turn that off. Let's give it another little check here. You can see how much stiffer this is. Now I gave this icing, it was in the mixer for about 4.5 minutes, maybe close to 5. And it's given me the perfect consistency to start working with. One of your other ways to tell if it's ready is it's turned completely white. There's no more yellow color like we had from the egg whites. So you can see how stiff that icing is. It will really hold a peak if I tap down on it. You can see how stiff and firm this icing is. So I'm going to take all of that icing that we've just made and put it into a bowl. I prefer to use a bowl that has a lid with it because I will add cling film to the top, but then I will also put a lid on top. If I don't use all of this icing, I'll store it in the refrigerator overnight and put the lid on. So let's add some cling film, and when you add the cling film, you want to make sure that you press it all the way down right onto the surface of the royal icing. You want to make sure that you're not letting any crusty bits kind of form, which could cause problems when you try to pipe. We're going to mix our first color here, and we're going to get started with the icing for the tulips. Let's start off with just getting some of our white icing into a bowl using a small spatula. Make sure that when you get your icing out, you cover that back up. I even cover the sides and press that cling film right against it. Grab a toothpick, or you can use a scribe tool, and I'm using some copper colored gel here. This is my favorite way to color, and I'm just going to use a little bit. I've found that when I add color, I like to start off with making it a little bit lighter probably than I anticipate that I want it to be, because it's always easier to add more color to darken it up or brighten it up than it is to take color away. And now I'm going to add some golden yellow. I really like adding these two colors. It gives it a little bit of a depth instead of just being one single color, which can be pretty if that's what you want to do, but these two colors just play so well together and it makes my own custom color. So you do want to make sure you get a clean toothpick every time you get gel color as well. You don't want to stick that icing into the coloring. Now we're going to grab our spray bottle and add 3 squirts of water. I love using a spray bottle because I can really control the amount of water that I use to thin this icing down. But you can still see how thick this is. So I'm giving it 3 more squirts of water and just mix that in well. And we're going to test our icing here in just a second. So to test it, to see how loose it is, you can see if it's going to glob off or fall off your spatula. And you can also see if you draw a figure 8 or you draw lines in the top of the icing, and then you count how many seconds it takes for those lines to disappear back into the icing. Now I counted this icing here and it took almost 30 seconds. So that's still way too stiff for me to be able to pipe with. It more than likely would not give me a smooth finish if I tried to pipe this on top of our tulips. You can see here where I'm pointing, those lines are just not going away. They're staying there even after 30 seconds. So I'm going to add just 2 more squirts of water. And adding water very, very slowly. If you don't have a spray bottle, you can use measuring cups, but I recommend no more than 1/8 of a teaspoon at a time. Now you can see how much looser just 2 squirts of water made this. I draw a little bit of a line and then I count to see how long it takes for those lines to go away. And you can see here, they're going away pretty quickly. This is about a 15-second icing. So I think that's perfect to go on top of our cookies. I'm not going to pipe an outline. But I am just going to flood with this icing. So I take my coupler, open it up, and I've got a number 3 tip. Cut off the end of your piping bag, and I do like to use couplers because I can change the piping tip anytime I want to. Add your piping tip and then screw on the rest of that coupler. Now grab a cup. This is the easiest way to put your icing into the bag. Open that bag up a little bit and just pour your icing right into it. It's best not to overfill these bags because they can either burst or they can be really difficult to work with if you have too much in there. Now I'm going to use a clip or a tie. You can tie the bag itself, but I'm using these little Wilton ties. You can also use a twist tie if you'd like to. We're going to move on to the green that we're going to use on our tulips. And to be honest, I'm not even going to wash the bowl. I'm going to keep that little bit of yellowish copper icing in the bowl and mix it right in with my green because that gives it a nice undertone that makes the 2 colors just go so well together, having a little bit of that yellow and the green. This is a forest green. And again, I'm not going with too much color here because I'd rather have to add more later if it's not dark enough. And I actually really like this color. You can decide for yourself if you want more or less, but we do need a little water just to thin it down. So add some water, stir it in, and you can see that it's pretty thick. This is more along the lines of that 30-second icing that we started with on the yellow, and that's perfect for the stems. So again, I'm using a number 3 Wilton tip, and I've got a coupler here. Open up and cut off the end of my piping bag. Pop that coupler holder in there. Maybe not do it upside down the way I did. Sometimes they just like to mess around with you. So make it go in there properly. Pop on your piping tip and screw that on. I do love couplers because, like I said, you can change the tip anytime you want to without having to use another piping bag. One of my goals is to use the least number of icings as I possibly can. I don't like to have 5 different colors in several different consistencies, so most of my designs will use limited consistencies and colors. Now we're going to just tie up the end of this bag, and I'll show you a little trick here. One easy way to get that icing down to the bottom without making too much of a mess is to use a scraper. This is a Pampered Chef scraper, but you can use any kind. And just squeeze that icing down. Don't be too vigorous. I've actually torn my bags occasionally doing this, but you just twist that up and put the tie on there, and now you won't be losing any icing out the top of your bag. And there's our 2 colors for our tulips. So let's get started on decorating these cookies. You're going to need a scribe tool, and you can use a toothpick as well. And I have this nifty little turntable, but if you don't have a turntable, and I put this non-stick surface on top to keep the cookie from sliding, you can also just use a piece of parchment paper. So go ahead and grab your copper yellowish icing, and we're just going to go around the edge, but we're going to leave a border because we're going to use our scribe tool to spread this icing out to the side. Some people will pipe a border on the edge with a thicker icing and then come back in and flood the inside with the thinner icing, but I prefer to save time in piping bags and just do this one piping step. So grab that scribe tool, and now that you've piped on that one petal shape, you're just going to do little small circles. That's going to help to spread your icing out towards the edge. And move those cookies so I can rotate my plate. You see how that icing just spreads? You can get it right to the edge, or you can reshape it if you haven't shaped it exactly right in the beginning. And this process of doing these little circles helps to pop any bubbles that you might have in your icing, which are inevitable. I will tell you, they happen all the time. So just keep turning that cookie, whether you have it on a piece of parchment paper on the table or countertop or on a turntable. It's just really easy to spin it and work on each edge. Just work it out to where you like. The beauty of doing flowers is that no two flowers are exactly the same, and no two flowers are perfect. So you can make what you might think is a mistake, but your flowers are still going to be pretty. Your flowers are still going to be, gorgeous. So if they're a little bit different, that's okay. If the shapes are a little bit different, that's fine. Now we're going to set this aside to dry just a little bit, and go ahead and do that step on the rest of your cookies with the first petal. You see how I put the one hand there to just steady the piping bag. And now that we've let these dry just a little bit, we're going to go ahead and pipe on our second petal. So take the same color icing and pipe a second petal. This one's a bit smaller, a little quicker, but we're going to do the same technique where we're going to just pipe it on there, leaving that little opening in the center. Take the scribe tool and spread it out to where you want it, and pipe and pop any bubbles that you see. Sometimes when your cookie sits for a minute or two, you'll start to see bubbles come up. And as long as your icing isn't too thick, you can go ahead and pop those bubbles. If your icing is really thick or starting to set, you're better off just leaving the bubbles there. And we're making sure that this goes right up to the edge of that other petal. Now the reason we let the first petal dry is so that we make sure that we have that line to show us definition between the two petals. If we pipe these two on at the same time, they would look like one large petal. So by letting the first one dry for a little bit before we add the second, we get definition. Now I'm going to add the green because the second petal is still wet, but we're not touching it with the green, so they won't bleed together. Just make sure that you do areas that are not touching if you're coming up with your own designs. Now our green is a little bit thicker, which I actually want, because if you look at a tulip, you'll notice that the petals and the stems have kind of ridges in them. So by having a slightly thicker icing and by using this tool, you can kind of create ridges, especially with the thicker icing. And you can see here that I'm just kind of pulling some of that icing up onto the petal. The back of a tulip petal does have kind of the little bits of green blending into it and spidering up, kind of, I guess, if that's a way we can describe it. So we'll let that dry, and now we're going to go back again to do our last petal with the copper yellowish color, and just pipe that little triangle in there. And then using your scribe tool, spread it out, make sure that it's touching those other petals and shape the way you want to. And there's your tulip cookie. I'm going to go back with the same colors that I used to color the icing. This is the copper, and I'm going to do some hand painting. Now, like I said, you can use the cookies exactly as they are. You don't have to do this hand painting step. They're still beautiful and everyone is still going to love them. But if you want to add just that little bit of extra touch, you can use these gel colors and do some painting. I've got a little bottle of vodka. You can use any clear grain alcohol because it evaporates very quickly, and that's good to dilute your colors. Now we're just going to mix it up a little bit. I'm using a palette knife, but you can use a paintbrush, toothpick, whatever is comfortable for you. If you need a little bit more vodka, go ahead and add a few more drops. These colors are super, super saturated when you use the gel colors, so you will get a lot of color. I probably put too much color there for this video, but I am doing a large batch of cookies, so I can rehydrate that color when I'm ready to do the larger cookies later. So I've got it pretty well mixed up. Clean off your palette knife, and I'm going to go for the golden yellow next. We'll mix up a little bit of that. And again, I'm using more than I really need, but I'm going to be doing a very large batch of cookies off camera, so I'm just going to mix all my colors right now. And if these colors start to dry up a little bit, you just add a little bit more vodka and remix, and nothing goes to waste. That's what I love about these gel colorings. So go ahead and mix up your golden yellow. Clean off that palette knife. And we'll go for the forest green. Now you notice these are the same colors that I used on the cookie itself in the icing, but the colors are very light and almost pastel on the cookie. We're going to add some contour and contrast here by using the same colors but at a much more concentrated level. Add a little vodka to your green and mix that up. I'm going to grab some very fine paintbrushes and just take a little bit of the yellowish color, the golden yellow, and some water. That's just water in that small bowl. Now I'm taking some of the copper color and mixing those together. I'm going to keep cleaning my brush and then add a little bit of vodka. Now we've kind of mixed the colors into the same color tone or color palette that we have on the cookie itself. It's just much darker, and we've added some vodka. Now you can choose to go with a lot more vodka or a lot more water, and we're just going to lay down a little bit of color in all of the ridges and along all of the edges. This is going to create contrast and a little bit of definition to our flower. And if your color is too dark, the beauty of it is you can use the pure vodka on your brush, or you can use water on your brush and just remove or tone down some of the colors. And I'll show you how to do that here in just one second. But go ahead and go around all the edges and all the contours with a little bit of that color there. Again, you can go darker or lighter. You could do pinks if you wanted to instead of the yellows and orange and copper. Completely up to you. I'm also adding a little bit more color there at the bottom because a lot of tulips are kind of two-tone, where the tops of the petals are a lighter color and the bottoms are darker. I know this looks like I've just painted a line around the edge, but we're going to soften that line up here in just 1 minute. I'm going to add a little bit of color to the bottom to have more of a two-tone flower. And there you go. Now I'm going to wash off my brush and get a little more water on your brush. Dab it on your paper towel so you still have a wet brush, but it's not sopping wet. And now you're just going to pull that color from the line that you've just painted on in from the edges. You don't have to coat the entire flower. You can leave the centers clear, or you can choose to pull it all the way out. I like to personally have a lot more color around the edges and less in the center. You can see how that's quite a dark patch there, but once I start really pulling this color and re-wet my brush, it kind of lifts that color and moves it around. And if you wanted to get rid of the color completely, you could take a clean, either dry brush or wet brush, and sop up some of that color from wherever you got too much. We'll just continue the process of pulling the color with a wet brush. And I'm going to pull up some of the color from the bottom as well. Kind of looks like it blends into the petal. Some of this I want to look like it very naturally goes from a dark to a light, but then some of it I want to see the streaks, especially down there at the bottom. And now I'm going to go back in, I'm going to add a little bit more of the same color that we just mixed to the tips. And this time, instead of blending them completely down the petal, I'm not going to blend them as much. I'm going to leave a little bit more concentrated there on the top. This is something you can really play with. Now I'm going to go in with just a little bit of the copper, straight up copper, and add that into the areas that I want either a shadow or a little bit of shade or just a little bit of a darker two-tone color. You would naturally expect that little inlet there on that third petal to be darker because it's behind the two front petals. So I'm going to keep a darker color there at the bottom. Add a little copper down at the bottom to get even more two-tone and more streaks on the bottom of my petals. If you wanted to, you could even pull up a picture of a tulip in nature, just a real tulip, and see how the colors vary. You very rarely will get one color throughout an entire tulip. And you'll just kind of play around with these colors until you're happy with your final design. Now I do let the, when I put a color on, I let it dry just a little bit before I start to pull it with the paintbrush and the water, because if you do it when it's wet, you basically just lift the color back off. But if you let it dry a little bit, it will spread instead of remove. So I'll soften up those tips that I just added with the copper. Just a little bit of a wet brush. Blend some strokes downwards in this flower. And I'm going to take another brush, which is even more fine. It's got an even thinner tip on it. And I'm going to use some of the green that we mixed up, just a touch. You can put some of your color over off to the side and just add some water to it. So this is very, very loose color because it's got a lot of water in it. Again, you could use vodka here too. And I'm just going to go around the edges and kind of accentuate the stem a little bit. I'm also adding a little bit of green just to the bottom of the petals, right in there with that copper orange, because the green does tend to bleed into the petals on a tulip, at least the tulips that I have growing in my garden. So you can see that's a bit darker right now than I want it to be, but I'm just adding that green where I think it would be natural, and then going back with some water and blending it in. Just pull up, pull out, however a flower would naturally grow. Now I'm going to take that same paintbrush and the same paint and just draw some lines to help give ridges to my stem. Now you can make some of these curved, kind of curve over to the side to kind of show how the stem is naturally bending in the wind, but just those lines really add a nice little touch to this. Now we're going to add those same lines using much more concentrated color to the petals, just to give some ridges. Now I just drag very, very lightly, and it doesn't matter if these are too dark because we are going to soften them up. So create some ridges and lines in your petals. And now I'm going to use a little bit of water just to soften those lines that I did. So once I hit them with a wet brush, not hit them, but paint over them with a wet brush, they've had a chance to dry because this dries very quickly, especially if it's mixed with vodka. And you're just going to soften those until you're happy with them. If they're really, really dark and you want to lighten them up, you can go over and over them until they almost disappear. Or you can add a little bit more if you want to. But I think softening with just a little water adds just the right touch. And there you have our finished tulip cookies. And I think they look so pretty on a platter, especially with our rabbit cookies that we're going to make in the next video. Thanks for joining me.